All right, good morning, everyone. This is Rose Hennessy. I'm with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and we're so glad that you joined us today. I'm sitting here at Marquette University in Milwaukee with Dr. Heather Hlavka. Yes, it was close enough. She gave me a head nod. And we're so glad you're here. We're going to be hearing a little bit about the social norm that we've talked about this year, normalizing sexual violence. And we're really excited to have her come in and talk about some of the qualitative research that she's done related to this and similar concepts. So just one or few logistics. Peter Fiala with our coalition is also on with us, but he's in Madison hosting as well. So if at any point you have any questions or things that come up that are tech issues, please feel free to use your questions, use the chat, and between Peter and I, one of us will get back to you. We're going to take questions as they come, and depending on context, we might take them right away or we might save them to the end, but we'll let you know. So thanks again so much for joining us. And with that being said, here is Assistant Professor Heather.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So everything is good? Yep. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have been asked to kind of talk about my work and some of the other academic work in the talk of normalizing violence and sexual violence in particular. And before we start, I just wanted to note that, like many of us here, I came to this work emotionally, physically, and also intellectually. So a little bit background: as an undergraduate in college, I heard so many stories of harassment and assault from friends, but also silence, shame, and system failure. And I experienced and listened to young women's struggles to make sense of these relationships, sexualities, and their experiences of assault. And though not always male aggression, but oftentimes self-blame. So I was very interested in the gaps between feminist discourses of no means no and yes means yes, especially in the mid-90s, and the complexities that individual women were dealing with on a daily basis. So oftentimes they spoke of coercion and force in sexual encounters, harassment by male professors, administrators, employers, peers. They spoke of being physically or verbally abused in relationships, but oftentimes insisted that this relationship was basically a good or a normal relationship, so as not to be confused with who were deemed real batterers or harassers or rapists. So during that time, I became a peer advocate on my campus. I did crisis line intervention. I accompanied men and women to ERs, to court, to counseling, and through other social services. We educated high schools. We educated on campus to athletes, clubs, and so forth. And then later in graduate school, I continued with crisis line work and facilitated rape survivor support groups and secondary victim groups. So during that time, I was writing on my dissertation work on children's perceptions of sexual violence and have published this work at Marquette and started additional research in the Milwaukee County courts tracking sexual assault adjudication, which myself and my colleague, Dr. Mula, are working on currently. So this is all just to give a little bit of background about myself, but also to really clearly state that I understand the bits and pieces and some of these issues that we're all concerned with. And together we have this combined expertise. We have different experiences, so I'm thrilled to have been invited to be part of this conversation with experienced providers, advocates, practitioners, and directors. And even though I'm sure much of what I will present today will sound very familiar to you, I'm excited about the conversations that we can have, mainly listening to ideas about how we can bridge the research practice gap and about what everyone is doing to create change in their little corners of the world. So with that, the work that I'll be presenting today is on my research and also that of other scholars who have addressed the normalization of violence and sexual violence. So I thought to kind of highlight the social norm for prevention from WCASA. I know that you will be, as I understand it, WCASA is presenting a series on these norms for prevention, including normalization for today, healthy sexuality, gender socialization, exploitation, and sexualization. And I mention these because the normalization of violence and sexual violence in particular stems from these elements, all these elements together. So inevitably I'll be discussing all these issues of gender norms, sexuality, rape culture, sexualization, objectification, and the media today. So that will be kind of combined in some of my work that I did on voices of children and youth. I thought that these voices of youth might be especially telling, and that their voices could honor a feminist framework and perspective that's rich with complexity and paradox. I was interested in why children don't tell when they are sexually assaulted, but in order to tell, there's got to be something to report and something that you appraise as wrong or as a harm. So if assault is accepted, if it's routine, if it's normalized, it's part of your peer culture, part of the way that you were brought up, part of the way that you belong to this peer culture, then really what are you going to tell? And so that was the question that really interests me in this normalization. Like I said, I will be talking about other work. So some of that I just wanted to highlight very quickly. I'll be talking about Lynn Phillips' work. Her work is called Flirting with Danger, if anyone is familiar with it, on young women's reflections on sexuality and domination. Mostly she's dealing with college samples, men and women in college. And I gave you a link here to the Media Education Foundation. They provide many documentaries about these kind of issues, and Lynn Phillips' work, Flirting with Danger, is also highlighted there. Another good source is Sharon Land's work, New Versions of Victims, Feminist Struggles with the Concept, and here we have authors like Janice Hacking, Claire Renziti, Lynn Phillips as well. So that's a really nice source and more of an academic source of feminists talking about this concept of normalization, but also the struggle with the concept of victimization. Some other work here I'm sure many are familiar with. Jacqueline Freeman's work, Jessica Valentini's work, Yes Means Yes. Deborah Tolman has done a lot of work on teenage girls talk about sexuality. And some other authors and scholars I've listed here below, just in case you're interested in some of the really interesting research and scholarly work being done on teenage sexuality, on talk of normalization of violence in particular, masculinity, femininity. Asking for It, The Rise of Rape Culture is relatively new as well. It's a more popular book. So some of these are very popular, others are scholarly. But they work really well together, and I'll be using them as we go out some of their work throughout this presentation. What is really popular, it seems, is that we've noticed that rape has become a really central issue in cultural narratives about agency, victimhood, and identity. And politicians have a lot to say about this. So backlash forces have seen victims as whining, hysterical females making much ado about nothing. Calling oneself a victim can now be seen as self-involved, lacking responsibility, and whining from a public that sees exaggerated claims of victimhood, and especially sexual assault. And we see this a lot on college campuses. So after all, rape is not today what rape once was. According to Tennessee Senator Henry, rape, when I was learning these things, was the violation of a chaste woman against her will by some party, not her spouse. Today it's simply, let's not go forward with this act. We also have talk of what is a legitimate rape, as I'm sure many remember from Todd Aiken. And if it's our representative in Wisconsin in 2011 said, if it's rape, it's rape. If it's not, it's not. And what he was referring to was his father's advice is that women will claim rape really easily when they just are disappointed the next morning when they wake up and decide that they want. So he claimed that their sexual experience was rape. So what we have is a lot of politicians telling us what rape is. We also have a lot of media telling us what rape is and what rape isn't. So reminiscent of those earlier quotes from 2000 and on, we're continuing in the same vein. And here I wanted to highlight just, for example, this conflating of hookups or the hookup culture with rape as if they're interchangeable. So here's an article quoting a clinical professor of psychology at Harvard who describes witch hunts on college campuses. He says most males would never do anything to harm a young woman, and we're starting to scare the heck out of the wrong people. The article goes on to quote men at Harvard and Stanford talking about how the heightened attention to sexual assault on campus is basically curtailing their hookups. One 20-something-year-old man says he won't be offering a female classmate a beer. I don't want to look like a predator. It's a little bit of a blurred line. Later he says, do I deserve to have my bike stolen if I leave it unlocked on the quad? The 22-year-old is saying we have to encourage people not to take undue risk that might make them targets of criminal conduct of others. So the risk that I assume that he's talking about is women actually daring to do what men are already doing, going out in public, drinking, partying, or really merely only going to class, walking on the street, or sleeping. So what we're talking about sexual assault as frivolous here, we're conflating it with a hook culture, and we're talking about it as a blurred line. I wanted to note that the Chronicle of Higher Education also published an article around the same time about how young men are feeling unfairly accused of sexual assault on campuses. They devoted a whole cover story, and this is really important to me because this is where a lot of educators and scholars are looking for higher education information, a whole cover story and center spread to the struggle of college men being falsely accused on campus. And they're quoted as saying, Title IX is allowing women to allege rape after alcohol-infused sexual encounters in which the facts are often murky. Thus, they aren't really truly taking responsibility for their actions. And so these men are fighting back with their parents and with lawyers to form a new national advocacy group started by one of the mothers of one young man. And she says, quote, fundamental fairness has become a pawn in the gender wars. In their rush to judgment, colleges are now substituting one class of victims for another. In another quote, the article depicts men being forced to leave prestigious universities, losing scholarships and places on their football teams. They want to be doctors and lawyers someday, and the charges rear their ugly head later. The comments of the article are also telling to me, and I'll just note one comment. One individual writes, and again, this is primarily scholars and researchers talking about this issue. If you were to tell someone and or a group of people long enough that they're victims, you can't be surprised when they start believing it themselves or when they start to take ownership of the term victim, whether it's right or wrong to do so. When I was in college, it was called having stupid drunk sex, and we had a culture of sexual liberation and experimentation. Now it's all just rape. It's rape hysteria activists that keep moving the goalposts as to what rape actually is. Every time the rape statistics go down, the goalpost is moved to include more and more acts of rape to keep people, jobs supported. Honestly, a lot of it stems from academics and activists whose careers rely on making sure that more and more people become victims. Right, so. So moving on to some of my work, this is just kind of to frame, thinking about the culture, thinking about politics, thinking about how everyone seems to be so heavily invested in sexual assault, really, in the term of victimization, who is a victim. So how can we then understand all of this backlash against movements to address sexual assault on campuses in particular? In my study, I really find the exact opposite in my work, and so do many others when we're talking about the normalization of sexual violence. And what I termed everyday violence is my study about girls' relational experiences with sexuality, harassment, and assault, coercion and consent, and how they negotiate their lived experiences in ways that are often ignored by law and policy and really rarely, if ever, discussed in the media. So first, objectification, sexual harassment, and abuse appear to be really part of the fabric of young women's lives. The lack of safe space was palpable. Girls were harassed at parties, at school, on the playground, and buses, and so forth. They overwhelmingly depicted boys and men as natural sexual aggressors, unable to control their sexual desires. They were commonplace and they were deemed normal. These abusive acts happened to everyone. In one quote, 13-year-old Kelly told the forensic interviewer about experiences with a 20-year-old man in her neighborhood. He would follow me around all the time, tell me I was beautiful and stuff, that he could have me whenever he wanted to. He did that all the time. He would touch me and say, am I making you wet? Do you want me? I think that's what he does, just how it goes, and everyone knows it and no one says anything. These other quotes about Patricia, age 13, talking about they grab you, touch your butt, and try to touch you in the front and run away. I think it's no big deal. They do it to everyone. And another quote from Lana, age 15, he tries to bring girls downstairs in the basement and try to force them to make out with them and stuff. And all this is joking. It's seen as normal. There was a culture of acceptable silence among girls. They were expected to participate in this culture of compulsory heterosexuality, which was deemed very normal. It might not have felt good. It might not have been wanted, but it was accepted. And even more confusing was when the young women had to grapple with their desire for attention, but the attention came in harassive and coercive forms. So violence then is normalized within this process of dating, of hooking up, of getting together, and it's happening through these gender and sexuality norms. This reminded me, of course, of statements that echo the Yes All Women campaign, in which users share examples of misogyny, violence, harassment, and discrimination that they experienced that was largely normalized and silenced by others in the culture. Some of the, which you see on Twitter and Facebook as well, some posts were from 15-year-olds, 16-year-old girls. One 16-year-old was talking about dress codes at school, and she says, I'm a 16-year-old girl. If you are over-sexualizing me, you are the problem, because teachers were telling her she shouldn't wear this, that she shouldn't wear yoga pants and a sweatshirt because it was too distracting for the young boys. I want to move a little bit into Lynn Phillips' work as well. So she talks about what counts as victimization. Lynn Phillips found that throughout her research, and again, this was a college sample, that a pervasive set of messages linked adolescent female sexual expression with victimization. So sexual involvement will inevitably lead to disaster of some kind: rape, disease, pregnancy, loss of self-respect, bad reputation, and the women must protect themselves at all costs. This discourse is invoked in the popular culture and by parents and other concerned adults. So you must take preventative measures not to express your sexuality, not to wear certain clothing, because men can't control themselves and will get the wrong idea. Women are also to be pleasing and passive, but certainly not a tease, not a slut, not promiscuous. So what can be a victim? Who can be a victim and who cannot? In this quote by Evelyn, age 21, she says, I think maybe victimization or rape should be reserved for really bad cases of rape. To say my experience was rape maybe waters down the cases of real victims. It feels, I don't know, unfeminist. There are a lot of factors of why he did what he did to me, so it's awfully complicated to talk about. The fact that he forced me, it happened within a whole lot of other things, so I don't think it would be fair to women who are outright attacked to call myself a rape victim. For Evelyn, labeling her experience of rape does a disservice to other women whose cases seem much more straightforward to her. Here's another quote about managing these kind of contradictions. Phillips talks about the together woman discourse, she calls, and it's a more contemporary kind of discourse than the pleasing woman discourse, but it's still very problematic. So it promotes the notion that the together woman is free, she's sexually sophisticated, entitled to accept nothing less but full quality and satisfaction in her sexual encounters and relationships, autonomy, self-direction, urging women to have it all. But this discourse exists alongside the pleasing woman discourse in media, magazines, movies, conversations with friends, and they promote women to participate in their own sexual objectification. So here, a quote says, I don't think women ever want to be abused. I wouldn't say I was abused because I knew this guy might want to have sex. I didn't think he was going to force it so far, but I did decide to go to his apartment. I chose to be in that situation. I didn't like it. It was really horrible, but I just should have made a different decision. So young women, we're finding in a lot of this research, are really struggling to manage a lot of these contradictory discourses. There are endless contradictions to manage. Among them are claims of contemporary women that they have embraced this victim identity, capitalizing on the politics of victimization forced on them by feminists and others on the left, that feminists have encouraged women to view themselves as victims, which in turn causes innocent man to be prosecuted or persecuted, right? So these claims obviously suffer many misconceptions, let alone statistics. There's no statistics to back that up. But even, most of these girls and young women in my study did not want to identify as a victim at all. They did everything in their power not to identify as a victim. Even at the end of the forensic interviews, after talking for so long, most of the girls didn't see their experience as worthy of reporting. They worried that they would get into trouble. They worried about their friends getting into trouble. They did not identify as a victim and certainly not a heroine. There were no searching for some privileged status. In fact, many were worried that someone would thought about their experience and that there would be rumors. So they're not eager to make false claims of victimization. Rather, they were remarkably reluctant or even adamantly opposed to considering themselves victims, and instead saw themselves as having and holding lots of agency, holding themselves accountable as the gatekeepers of men's behaviors, men's uncontrollable urges, and thus blame themselves when they were exploited or abused. So how does this happen? I also talk about instruments of coercion. So, and as does Lynn Phillips in some of her work. Some of this happened, everyday violence happened in these relationships. In particular, instruments of coercion were used mostly by older men who controlled material items or space away from adults. Older men were in control of alcohol, drugs, space, places away, parties. They were control of when the girls could hang out, play basketball, watch movies, and just party. And this was in my work, which was young children, so around the ages of 11, 12, 13. And this is also found in Lynn Phillips' work, so of young women reflecting back on their experiences, but she talked to women who were 19, 20, 21. So, for example, men would move from girl to girl in peer groups. They would exchange or barter material resources for sexual favors. The young women described these situations as something they just endured. Normal stuff that guys do, no big deal. Sexual favors seemed to be the cost of hanging out with friends, being accepted in the group. And this is really reminiscent to me also of fraternities and house parties where men control access to alcohol and space. This is all, of course, the exploitation of vulnerabilities, right? So Phillips presents one participant, Diana, who I will quote from her work. Diana's experience is an example as well of the cost of vulnerability. After leaving home at age 14, she moved in with her teacher and began having a physical relationship with him. Indebted to him for providing shelter and support, she was unable or unwilling to consider her experience with him abuse. She says, I left home at 14. I stayed with my teacher, which was really great, but when I look back on it, it was really weird. He was so cool. I mean, he took care of me, he fed me, and he was 35, I was 14. I love him for what he did for me. He was sensitive to the fact that I was so young. I wasn't sexual. He was cool about that. I would just undress for him, and he would masturbate, or I would jerk him off or something. But he never laid a hand on me. He knew I was just young. We had to be really careful about going out. They would have made it into something abusive or illegal. But it wasn't because he really protected me. If it wasn't for him, I would have been lost. I would have been out on the streets. And one of my examples from my work, Abby talks about what we call working a yes out. 12-year-old Abby is an ideal example about how young girls struggle to interpret the experience. That's really far outside these discourses of victim-agent dichotomies. So she describes how a 19-year-old man treated her like a maid or a toy, a Barbie doll to be used and thrown away. She describes how he would pull her hair. She nervously laughs and says, so I don't know what he did. He'd grab my hair and he'd pull me closer and he'd just pull my hair backwards, push my head or something like that. It would be weird. I don't know what he did. Very tellingly, she does not link physical and verbal coercion as abuse in the context of normalized heterosexual relationships. Later, she takes responsibility for his actions, uncovering the power of heteronormative discourses that support a sexually unconstrained, emotionally detached male, but this relational female. I wanted to note also Wade and Helsman's work, and they talk about a college sample as well. Here's a quote from their work that highlights this. Rachel told a story in which she hooked up with two guys to try to prevent her unconscious friend from being raped. Ultimately, she had intercourse with one because she was too wasted to say no when he pulled off her pants, and the other assaulted her friend while she was unable to protect her. Reflecting on the night, Rachel said it had its bad moments, but it overall wasn't bad, even as she questioned whether she had been raped or not. Below is a link to some of Lisa Wade's and Haldeman's work, and I believe this link will bring you right to the article that they published this work in. And their sample included 44 college students. 33 of them were women and 11 were men, and they wrote over time about their sexual behaviors and attitudes during their first year of college. Many of them showed that pressure is extremely normal, and there's lots of tactics that are used to stop men from raping them. So in this case, Rachel was trying to stop these men from raping her friend, but also we find that oral sex is actually used to stop what many women might deem as rape or intercourse as rape. So oral sex is used to kind of stop men, tactics to use them from stopping them from raping them. So back to my work is a theme I call accounts of consent. And so I explored how women were also talking about how they accounted for consent for their friends. And when girls do that, they link everyday harassment and violence to attributions of blame. So girls criticized each other for not successfully maneuvering men's normalized aggressive behavior. Not only did offenders proactively spread rumors that someone was a slut, but other girls followed suit. So they were cast as promiscuous. Girls were deemed complicit in their own rapes, and this precarious balancing act of attaining sexual status, slander of the slut, was very powerful. So you can see in these quotes, Lily, age 14, talks about how there's rumors about her being spread already. Kylie, 14, says that he was calling names. He was calling me a hoe and a slut and all that kind of stuff. And I had to give him a lap dance and everything, that I was like asking for it, that I wanted to be with him, and everyone believed him. And Jackie, age 15, says, I don't know why she's making such a big deal out of it. He does it to everyone. So I say, well, just back off. I say no. So she should have said, she would have, if she don't want it, but she probably wants it anyway. So young girls were using these descriptions, talking about each other, to kind of make themselves not victims, to point out their agency and their power, I think, in a way to say, well, what happened to me was an assault, and all you have to do is say no. Certainly that doesn't work. Saying no doesn't work a lot of the time. So it's not a foolproof remedy for the situation. Wade and Haldeman's work finds similar issues. Several women reported being manipulated into performing fellatio, as I mentioned before. So Carrie Ann here told a story. He didn't have a condom, and he didn't want to get off inside me. I ended up giving him a blowjob because he wouldn't leave me alone. In their work, they find there's a lot of pressure and coercion. Consent, again, is really worked out. It's working a yes out. It's using tactics to get someone basically to leave you alone, so fellatio in order not to have sex. Hillary said a lot of boys, they feel it necessary to drink hardcore, and when they're drunk, they try to push you into engaging in sex. Charlotte echoed this when she said that even nice guys feel pressured into having sex, and thus pressure women into having sex with them. Another really great source for this kind of information on college campuses is Armstrong and Hamilton's work, and they talk about gendered sexuality in young adulthood, all the double binds and flawed options. And that work is really formative as well. Lynn Phillips' work reiterates the forming of attributions and how young women are developing strategies for controlling the damage of the abuse that they've encountered in their lives. So in order to avoid naming their experience as victimization, they are internalizing cultural discourses that encourage them to resist naming that and instead deem it normal heterosexual encounters, or it's due to their behavior. Robin said I should have been more assertive. I was trying just to get out of the situation as gracefully as possible. I don't know, I should have been more assertive, but I was trying to tell him I didn't want to. Maybe my no wasn't no enough. and oftentimes it is not. Jean 18 said, I really should have been more careful. You can't go around strutting your stuff without it catching up to you. When I think about it, I mean, really, what did I expect? And Robin 21 reflects on her experiences, saying that she remembers her mother talking about actually a newspaper article about a case of acquaintance rape that came out, and they were talking about it at the kitchen table together. And she remembers her mother saying, she just said that the girl must have deserved what she got. She said if you're going to be promiscuous, you're asking for it. Even though the rape, if I remember, it was pretty brutal. It was like her being victimized wasn't surprising or wasn't even relevant. It was like her fault, not the guy's. And I point this out because there's a lot of attributions that also come from others that will explain the normalization process too. From my work here, some of the contradictions are coming from caregivers, they're coming from adults, from parents and family. So here's an excerpt from the larger study that I did on sexual victimization, and it's related to how people are blamed for their own assaults. In this case, this is Beth, and Beth was sexually abused on and off from the age of 7 to 11 by her cousin. So the offender was about 16 years old at the age of onset. Beth here talking is 14. And again, here she makes a clear distinction between someone believing her and someone supporting her. She says that her parents are with her. The interviewer asked about whether her parents believe her, and they say, yeah, but they don't support me. I don't know. We don't talk about it. My grandparents don't believe me. They say I'm lying. They don't even like me because they don't like the way I dress or anything. They're like, oh, Beth's a whore anyway, so it doesn't matter. And her grandparents are calling her a whore. And again, Beth is 14. She is, here's the trope of rape, right? The women as liars or sluts, undeserving of assistance because they ask for it by the way they act or the way they dress. I mean, this is obviously a complicated situation. You're talking about a male cousin, someone in the family. But these are the words that Beth was getting from her family, lack of support, lack of believing. I did want to mention briefly the pornification of mass media. This is not my specialty. I looked up the scholarly literature on about it a bit. And unfortunately, we don't really know, okay? There hasn't been a lot of research on this. I think everyone thinks, some scholars have addressed whether access to internet pornography has emerged as an influence on young people's, and especially men's, attitudes towards sex and their sexuality. Census that it has rewritten the sexual script to include anal and oral sex. But little is known about how pornography uses cultural mores on a wider scale. So really more research really needs to be done on this. We do know that over 90% of teens have access to internet pornography. We do see mass media mirroring pornography in a lot of ways, and there's research on that. You can look at Levy's work, her book. It's a popular book as well. She's a journalist. It's called Female Chauvinist Pigs. And she talks about raunch culture that celebrates sexually explicit images and themes, that encourages young women to participate in their own sexual objectification. Some researchers ask whether the pornification of mass media may correlate with participation and endorsement of the hookup culture, just as media violence is positively correlated with aggression. It might also correlate with self-objectification, sexual objectification in U.S. culture, and sexualization of girls in the media. And I included some interesting sites below that you can see. Some people are kind of exploring this issue, and especially as it's related to hookup cultures on college campuses, and actually whether they exist or not. So that's still being worked out as well. Okay. So I wanted to switch a little bit into talking about boys. So this work hasn't been published yet. It will be published soon in the journal Men and Masculinity, so it's forthcoming. It comes from the same data. And this idea of normalization also occurs with boys, too, just really differently in highly gendered ways. So while boys were not directly blamed for their assaults, as we saw in Beth's case, they were implicated in their assaults based on heterosexual discourses of male sexuality. So boys as aggressors, as always wanting sex. In all of these cases, the young boys were sexually abused by female offenders in these cases that I'm noting. So Noah was abused by another foster child in his home, and Brent was abused by a cousin close in his age. The caregivers at least partly depicted the abuse as reciprocal, normal, and really not a big deal. Boys were meant to have sexual relations with girls. That's what boys do with girls, right? So just like young women in the study that we were highlighting, these very young boys ranging from age 6 to 17 were appropriating discourses from a patriarchal culture that normalizes and often encourages male sexual power, particularly within the context of heterosexual relationships. Normative heterosexuality then involves the presumption that men have a special and overwhelming urge or drive towards heterosexual intercourse. When masculinity is based on domination, men's sexuality is his own and nothing can intrude on that. What happens when that experience falls out of that purview, however, when you no longer fit into that worldview, you're no longer a man, you're cast as other, and you have to hide behind or prove your masculinity. So in my study, young men really struggled with the cultural ideologies that reinforce sexual victimization as violating codes of masculinity at best and really occupying invisibility at worst. Here are a couple more quotes from young men who were really depicting how they were expected to demonstrate sexual dominance over women. These two were female perpetrated victimization experiences. They saw that as really contradictory to traditional social expectations. In several cases with adolescent men, assault by a woman was described as neutral or inconsequential. Robert, age 17, described sex with his mother's friend as weird but fine. And 14-year-old Ken rhetorically asked the interviewer, "Can boys be sexually abused?" While he denied that sexual abuse took place at the hands of his father's live-in girlfriend, hypothetically, he referred to it as if it would have ever happened, that it would be sloppy seconds. So that was really interesting to me because Ken draws on specific discourses, taking up a language of dominance and agency and objectification of women. So he's really positioning himself as in control by rejecting a woman's advances and shaming and degrading her sexuality at the same time. Here we have, so if we talk about the normalization of sexual violence, for men, I really talk about it in a way of normalization of stigma and silence. So men aren't normalizing the sexual violence against them. For them, it's not normal, unless it's perpetrated by a woman. Then they can deem it as normal heterosexual relationships. But if it's perpetrated by a man, they know right away that that's not normal, that it's wrong. But it's wrong for so many stigmatizing reasons. And the normalization and really silence. So from very early ages, boys are emphasizing a loss of masculine heteronormative identity that's reinforced by the stigma of homosexuality. So the myth of male rape is that it's always about homosexuality, that only gay men rape, only gay men can get raped, or if you are raped, you're gay. When asked by the interviewer if his older male cousin ever touched anyone in his family, here's Lawrence, age 11, said, if he did, that's disgusting. The interviewer asks, that's disgusting. Lawrence says, yep, that's about the nastiest thing you can do. That's gay. It's not okay because you're supposed to like girls. Girls supposed to like boys. And that's just how it should go. Later he says, that's what I think. I like girls. I don't like anyone else. He's very clear that that just cannot happen, that means someone would be gay, and that's the grossest, nastiest thing that can happen. When I note below here exploitation of young men's sexuality and identity, there were several occasions where the exploitation from the perpetrator, the male perpetrator, really came through men's sexuality. So perpetrators exploited men's sexuality and identity to coerce and victimize young men who spoke of their experiences with both ambivalence and acquiescence. Cody, age 14, was assaulted by two 20-something-year-old male acquaintances that he met on the internet, who later sent him pictures and then met him in person. Cody identified as gay, and the men threatened to out him to his parents if he didn't continue the sexual relationship with them. So young gay men who are already identifying as gay or are questioning their sexuality were made complicit in their own assaults by perpetrators who used trust and acceptance as a mechanism of coercion. So playing on sexual scripts that included testing, teaching, experimentation, perpetrators often exploited young men's desires to belong and to be accepted, especially when they were struggling with their sexuality. In another case, John, age 16, was sexually assaulted by his male cousin's 27-year-old live-in boyfriend. He told the interviewer that the perpetrator befriended him and took an interest in his sexuality. He sexually assaulted John on more than 5 different occasions under the guise of affection and experimentation, empathy and acceptance. He did not intend to report his victimization. However, his cousin was threatening to throw him out of the house, and he had nowhere to go because his mother had abandoned him, and he needed to stay with his cousin. So here we have a lot of vulnerability on the part of John, but we also have the stigma of homosexuality. It was exploited by perpetrators, and it really limited young men's willingness to disclose or even talk about sexual victimization. Young men who are gay or questioning might be especially vulnerable to perpetrators who exploit their feelings of difference, of deviance, but also desire, and they manipulate boys under the guise of affection, belongingness, or experimentation. Lack of sexual consent and neutrality is largely presumed for heterosexual men who are victimized by men, but this is not self-evident for gay men struggling with these issues of consent and sexual desire. How my time is. You're doing great. I'm going to highlight one recent study a really recent study that came out in 2015. And this is absolutely fascinating because we're talking about coercive sexual environments. And it's the Let Girls Be Girls report from the Urban Institute. The purpose of the paper of this research that was longitudinal and really over a decade of work, the researchers explored what they call coercive sexual environments as a gender-specific phenomenon that has unique consequences for low-income girls of color in communities of concentrated disadvantage in the U.S. The authors wanted to raise attention to a phenomenon they call coercive sexual environments, which too often affect adolescent girls of color living in urban neighborhoods. This is not to further stigmatize an already stigmatized population, low-income men and women of color, but to understand the complex realities, the institutional challenges, and the underlying circumstances, rather than reducing these issues to individual behaviors. So they focus on the effects of living with chronic violence and predatory threats. Boys and girls are both affected by these environments. Girls are experiencing harassment and violent sexualization, and boys are being forced to accept it or to be passive bystanders or aggressors. Research shows that when disadvantage and violence are great and collective efficacy and social control are low, a gender-specific neighborhood mechanism can emerge that has different effects on male and female youth. Some communities develop pervasive coercive sexual environments in which harassment, domestic violence, sexual exploitation of women and very young girls becomes an everyday part of life. What is it like to live with chronic violence and predatory threats that can strain community life? This happens in a variety of contexts. The effects can include poor mental health, fear, risk of delinquency and early sexual initiation, teen parenthood, risks of victimization, physical health problems, sexually transmitted infections, school dropout. So these coercive sexual environments can be validated and they emerge across a variety of contexts. So some of these contexts include not only these urban environments and neighborhoods, right, but they can include college campuses. I would argue they include high schools, workplaces, they can include military bases, and of course these are going to happen in different ways because some contexts have more social support in them than others. But coercive sexual environments don't occur in isolation. They grow out of historic and ongoing racial segregation, as well as cultural and society norms that encourage harassment and violence. And they are place-based and they are gender-specific. So what the authors lay out in the report is they concentrate on 3 kind of issues that they would like to focus on. One is society and culture, so rates of harassment, violence, and poverty. right? As we know, in the U.S., 1 in 2 women have experienced some form of sexual harassment in her lifetime. 1 in 5 experience sexual assault. 56% of girls in middle and high schools report sexual harassment, but some are even more directly affected depending on the setting in which they find themselves. Poverty plays a huge role in how survivors are able or unable to heal from their experiences and get support services and resources. So that's one of the arguments for focusing on neighborhoods as well. They focus on systems and institutions. The legacy of segregation and discrimination in federal, state, and local policies and practices means that many low-income African Americans live in neighborhoods that lack quality housing, schools, basic services, and that includes police. Schools are not safe anymore. They used to be a safe place. Schools serve as punitive disciplinary systems rather than sources of support. Schools are failing to intervene in situations of sexual harassment and bullying, and instead they tend to separate out, in particular, Black girls from their schools for acting out or fighting back, and they lead them into the justice system. So we've heard a lot about the prison, the school-to-prison pipeline. Well, we can also talk about the victimization to imprisonment pipeline for young girls who are running away, who are truant, who are in the foster care system, who are experiencing harassment and don't go to school because they no longer want to be abused. And number 3, the domain of the neighborhood. So evidence suggests that the risk of sexual violence is greater in disadvantaged communities, even among couples who have higher incomes in these areas. So some of this is because of addiction, high rates of incarceration, absence of basic amenities like grocery stores and laundromats. So youth really have to work hard to master their environments and ways to survive a lot of this chaos. Let's see how we're on time.
We technically have till 11:30.
Oh, okay, so much more to say. So this work is really fabulous. It's really interesting because it's been decades of research on the lives of women and girls in these distressed neighborhoods, and it's led the authors to conclude that in the most disadvantaged communities, concentrated poverty, chronic violence, and social disorder leads to both low collective efficacy and really the emergence of this coercive sexual environment. And in these communities, girls are at risk for early sexualization, exchanging sex for things they need, and experiencing sexual harassment or sexual assault, all of which contribute to poor mental and physical health outcomes. We see this in a lot of settings. My sample, I should note, was quite diverse when we're talking about race and ethnicity, and especially income. So the class of the children and the youth were very diverse. So in my work, I do see the same thing, kind of exchanging sex or sexual activity for goods and services. And in this work, they're finding that that's also happening in and much more so on a more large scale in urban environments that have coercive sexual environments. Here is the link to the publication in which they also talk about a lot of strategies to combat this, which I will return to in a moment. I had to talk about Steubenville, why not? Because it really connected to me with this coercive environment, right? So we don't want to further stigmatize disadvantaged communities. And these coercive sexual environments happen in a lot of places. Here we see it, of course, happening in the high school. So there's numerous stories like Steubenville. But this case promoted really and prompted a discussion about bystanders, about all of us living in these coercive environments and how it's maintained, perpetuated, and perhaps normalized. Kate Harding's work in her book, Asking for It, she goes through the Steubenville, Ohio case. Here on the side, I put some of the media reactions and discourse that was used by CNN, ABC News, NBC, USA Today, etc., and how much of the focus was on the boys and not the victim, of course, as we remember. So in her book, Kate Harding goes through the case, and she also really focuses on the details of it, right? So a couple of guys, popular ones, are with this woman, the 16-year-old girl at a party. They decide to leave the party. They bring her along to another. There she vomits. Other people notice how disoriented she seems. This is only one part that she remembers. The guys take her to another person's house, and in the car on the way there, someone removes her shirt, and one of the guys puts his finger inside her vagina. The other ones are taking pictures and videos. They take her to the basement of the third house and strip her naked. One of the football stars puts his penis in her mouth. She passes out at this point. Another star decides to penetrate her vagina with his fingers. People take more video and more pictures, including one of the football stars, Trent Mays and Malik Richmond, holding the girl just off the floor by her hands and feet in this picture. Her limp, unconscious body is swinging between them. Her face will be blurred out when this photo makes national news, but everyone knows her and will recognize her. And what really made headlines, of course, was in a dorm room at Ohio State University. On the same night, a young man was watching a 12-minute video of this assault taking place and narrates what's happening on screen to yet another camera. According to the play-by-play, he believes the video that he's being showed is her being anally raped and urinated on while she's unconscious. And yet he says, that's how you know she's dead, because someone pissed on her. These are quotes. He believes he's watching the gang rape and dehumanization of an unconscious 16-year-old girl. And on and off throughout the 12 minutes, he and friends in the background are laughing. He says, she's so dead. She's deader than O.J.'s wife. She's deader than Trayvon Martin. She's so raped right now. They raped her harder than the cop raped Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction. They raped her quicker than Mike Tyson raped that one girl. They raped her more than the Duke lacrosse team. And I mention this case, of course, because here we have a lot of references to media. We have a lot of references to cases coming out where people were deemed to be falsely accusing. He says, is this really rape? This wasn't rape because you don't know if she wanted it. She might have really wanted it. It might have been her last and final wish. So as uplifting as that is, what needs to happen? Well, what the research is telling us and what scholars and researchers are talking about is clearly we need more research. We also need more action. Focusing on coercive sexual environment, more work needs to explore and document the nature of these environments, addressing characteristics across neighborhoods and contexts. Do they range in severity? Are there other differences? How are they resisted? Because we do know that youth are resisting these environments as well, and they're thriving. And so how are they doing that? Other communities should include urban, but also tribal communities, or places that have endured long conflicts like Central America, college campuses, military bases, or other coercive sexual environments, as I noted, high schools. But they're likely to have higher levels of social organization. So how might they differ? How are coercive sexual environments experienced in these settings? And what is the role of collective efficacy in all these settings? How is it experienced by LGBTQ persons? More work clearly needs to be intersectional, and all researchers are talking about that. We need cross-sample comparisons. Most of the studies on hookup culture in particular remains non-intersectional, so we know very little about how sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, class, religious affiliation, disability, and other variables influence the shape of sexual cultures at institutions. There's some preliminary evidence, of course, and actually it's Wade and Heldman, that lower income students, students of color, religious students, mostly evangelical, and gays and lesbians are less likely to hook up than their counterparts. So we have to start talking about why and when. So cross-college, cross-neighborhood comparisons. National campaigns must start to focus on girls and women, especially girls and women of color. Lots have been said about men and boys of color, especially recently with Black Lives Matter movements. But we're rarely still talking about girls and women. We need to do so on a large scale. And we also need to focus on neighborhood development for decent, affordable housing, safe neighborhoods, and good schools. Many educational initiatives are place-based, so like curriculum in schools, right, or college campuses, but very few are neighborhood-based. And we know that many schools are more and more frequently not neighborhood schools. And so that really matters. People are coming from different schools or different neighborhoods. So we need to think about what neighborhoods they're coming from and how they're working and dealing with coercive sexual environments that might be very different from their counterparts in schools. That same work, Let Girls Be Girls, talk about 4 really promising curricula of a program called Promoting Adolescent Sexual Health. I'm sure many people know about that. If not, they do talk about it at some length in the report. So that includes Sisters Rising, Brothers Rising, which was developed in partnership with Men Can Stop Rape. It's talking about how youth matter and parents matter. Education in these cases needs to be early and ongoing. I don't think it's too early to ever start educating about bodily integrity and consent. So I also would add in that we want to allow youth to speak for themselves. They do so in peer groups. They can do so with a facilitator. But we have to start understanding what their experiences are and the complex realities that youth are going through, instead of forcing them into these curriculum that forces women and girls to label themselves as victims. Because really what we're seeing is they don't want to do that, and they're going to resist that, and we have to understand why and what we can do to kind of move forward with that. Middle school and high school students are having sessions on safe dating, on boundaries, harassment, and that highlights the consequences of this behavior for perpetrators. They might review laws and policies, but also increasing faculty surveillance of unsafe areas in schools. My work shows the same thing. There are certain areas in high schools and elementary schools that are unsafe. The one quote was the young man who took the girls into the basement. There are places that are not watched, and faculty and teachers need to know about these places, take them seriously. And parents, I think parents groups, this is really great. We need to educate parents. Parents matter, and they are with their children every day. And so this Parents Matter was developed by the CDC to give parents and guardians of youth the knowledge, skills, and comfort to talk about sex with their children, to talk about sexuality and the sexual risk reduction. Give them information, give them research, give them media, talk to them about pornography, because they're going to talk to their kids. And we know that parents are not comfortable with this. They don't want to talk to their kids. They think if they don't talk to it, talk to them about it, it won't happen. This is just mirroring our educational systems. That is, don't include sexual education curricula. This isn't working. It hasn't worked. And if we can get parents involved and maybe talk about some of these cases, talk about what the research is showing us, they might be a little bit more concerned to think that their children are going through this as well. And finally, I kind of wanted to end with some other feminist challenges that are being discussed in the literature as well. Surely this is going to be a little bit more broad based, but I do think that this is really important to highlight. As I started with, there is a backlash on female autonomy and the role of women in society, the construction of the family. I think we need to challenge these agendas, largely from the right wing, but these backlashes that were launched by focusing on a war on sex, anti-abortion, anti-contraception, anti-sex education movements that promote rape culture, really. And it's a war on human rights, our human right to bodily autonomy and self-determination. Women pose a threat to power structures, right? So the constant threat of rape keeps everyone in line. We need to focus on bodily autonomy and integrity that includes equality and reproductive freedoms. I think these go hand in hand for a couple reasons. Legally forcing a woman to carry a pregnancy for 9 months and give birth against her will without her consent, even if she is raped or coerced. We coerce certain kinds of unfit women, in quotes, into not reproducing. These are very troubling issues, and that uses women's body to serve the needs and ideologies and desires of others. Allowing women a full range of reproductive freedoms affirms the fact that women's bodies are private property, rather than owned or sold or protected by others, that their sexual and reproductive choices should not be forced or coerced. Women's bodies matter, and they should have that choice. Black lives matter, LGBTQ rights matter, and they are all interconnected as they focus on autonomy, integrity, consent, choice, and voice. The feminist challenge is also to think about altering dominant narratives that say women's bodies aren't our own. Instead, the narrative should be replaced by healthy sexuality and education, boundaries, that sex is about consent and enjoyment. It's not about violence, harm, coercion, capitulation, or surrender, and to attack power structures that continue to frame women as victims and men as perpetrators. I think these are very damaging because they put us into categories. They're clearly damaging to boys as well, who feel that they can never talk about being victimized. Feminists insist that men aren't animals, that men are thinking, moral, rational, fully capable of listening to their partners and understanding that sex isn't about pushing someone to do something they don't want to do. Plenty of men are able to grasp this idea, and the idea that sex is joyful and should be entered enthusiastically by both partners, and that the absence of no isn't enough. A yes should be the baseline requirement. We need to teach men about privilege and entitlement, positive masculinities, challenging and disrupting cultural and institutional practices and assumptions that support women, blame and deny male and societal accountability. And so finally, while institutions increasingly acknowledge female victimization and offer women some official means of redress, they do very little to disrupt and actually often promote the structural power imbalances and problematic discourses that help give rise to victimization in the first place. Women need to talk about what they've experienced without being punished for doing so, for trying to navigate contradictory discourses. So listen to youth. There's overwhelming resistance to the claim that victimization, that they were victimized. So that's very compelling to me, and we should think about what to do with that kind of language and that kind of understanding. We need collective action and safe spaces. Zero tolerance policies in schools create a culture of silence, and they do not deal with the complex realities that youth are faced with, and then they instead force young people into categories and boxes that they often resist. We need to stop surveilling and sexualizing girls' clothes and dress code policies that contribute to a rape culture and that blame girls for unwanted sexual attention. We need to create safe spaces where women and men can come together to talk, where they can share their stories, envision other possibilities, and work together towards change. With such a place, women might be able to pool their collective strengths and insights and demand steps towards equality. And I always try to end a little bit on a positive note, which sometimes is difficult. But here, of course, there are movements where women and men are coming together. Lots of this is obviously happening on college campuses, but I haven't seen this kind of movement in a long time. So we know the case of Emma at Columbia, a Columbia senior who was carrying her mattress while her rapist remained on campus. Fellow students are shown here responding to the call to carry the weight together from class to class. So this collective carry was organized by students and alumni to give her and other survivors of sexual assault a powerful symbol of support and solidarity, to show the administration that they're united and demanding better policies. There were protests at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee campuses last year to fight a fraternity using the date rape drugs in drinks where several students were getting sick and went to the hospital, so people coming together. And the work of women across college campuses, which was really spurred by the Center for Public Integrity and the numerous stories they did about campus rape, but also these young women working on campuses that's highlighted in the new documentary, The Hunting Ground, to revive Title IX. It was there, it wasn't being used, it wasn't being administered properly on college campuses. So, their institutions created a social movement that also prompted the White House to take action with campaigns and new discourses and discussions, and also enforcement of Title IX. So I don't think there's any reason why we can't think about this as happening at high schools, as happening in middle schools and elementary schools. they can take on that task as well, and I hope to see that kind of movement happening soon. You know, not surprisingly, we already have people coming out, presidents of universities, in particular Florida State, saying that this documentary was is false, it's fabricated journalism. He actually the president of Florida State actually told his campus body not to watch it, that it's hysterical, fabricated, false reporting. So, of course, we're going to see backlash, but I think these are really promising movements and promising that women are being listened to on college campuses. So I'm going to end there and kind of go to the possibility of discussion to hear about what other people are doing in their work. I hope that I presented some of the research. You know, as an ending point, there really isn't that much that really focuses on normalization. A lot of it is this qualitative work, but I do think it's being discussed more. It combines with the gender norms, the sexuality norms, the exploitation, and objectification. So it's really kind of combining. We're normalizing it because all of that becomes normal, these social norms. So researchers are thinking about next steps and kind of the feminist challenges ahead. So thank you very much. I'll stop talking.
So we'll, I posted, feel free to go into that chat if you have any questions, if you have any comments. You can also share that you'd like to be unmuted, and we could go in and do that now. So I'll give everyone a minute or two to go through that. And in the meanwhile, there's one or two things that I wanted to bring up listening through. I know that you had mentioned that you were doing a current project right now with males and their kind of views with sexual experiences and violence. And I was wondering, you talked a little bit about that, but if you could share more about where you are in the process with that research, or just a little bit more logistics about what's happening with that.
In the same way as I found, this is a larger study. It comes out from a larger study, so I have over 200 cases that I've looked at of young women and men, actually ranging from ages 3 to 17, being interviewed by forensic interviewers, and they were talking about their experiences, and this is a very open-ended interview in which they could really express whatever they wanted to express. So in the same way as I found some of these narratives from young women coming out, talking about the normalization of things that they went through, I was interested in how boys were experiencing sexual violence as well, obviously, and what was hindering them from telling. And one of the things that came out clearly was the stigma of homosexuality, but also really a normalization of silence. And of course, that normalization of silence is for boys and girls, but it just happens in very gendered ways. And boys reported less. They didn't talk about their experiences in detail. They really resisted during forensic interviews more so than young women did. Resisted in talking about the experiences and reporting experiences. There was lots of talk about they were fearful that they would be gay. They thought they would be gay. In one case, I remember a young boy being abused by his grandfather over a very long time, and he said he would just freeze. He froze up. He would disconnect from his body because he really feared that if he felt the physical sensations that he would be gay. I mean, we need changing discourses about that, clearly. That has not changed. And the status of my work right now is, I think I mentioned that article should be published sometime soon. Sometimes there's a lag time, but in the Journal of Men and Masculinity. So some of the work that I presented today will be explained in more depth in that journal article.
Other questions that folks have? All right, we have a question here. It says, I'm curious about the experiences of survivors who talk about, quote, giving in as giving consent and struggle with self-blaming, victim-blaming after these encounters that feel really blurry because consent was given but not really willingly. Do you know if there's any research on this topic or recommendations of literature along these lines?
That is a really great question, and I'm thinking of the one source that I've come across is actually a master's thesis that was done at Marquette. So I have presented this in my classes before, and it's taught, the author talks about those kind of differences. And I will have to find the exact citation because it's escaping me, but I can do that. She researched couples on Marquette's campus, and basically asked them about the kind of sexual encounters that they were having. So they were in pretty long-term relationships, I think 6 months to a year or more. And really what she then started talking about was the difference between, was basically that a lot of people are having sex that they don't want to have. So I don't know if that gets at the question a little bit, but you have a lot of women and men blaming themselves, not wanting to have sex, but having sex. And the percentages for men and women were equal. So I present this to my classes, and they're astonished. They think, oh, only about 5% of men are going to say that they're having sex that they don't want to have. It's upwards of, I think she quoted about 56% of men were saying that they were having unwanted sexual encounters with their partners. And women were doing so too. And so they were doing it for different reasons. But that's the only really research that I know that is delving into how much sexual activity people are having, even in these, monogamous relationships that they don't want to have. So lots of people don't want to have sex. Men, they don't feel good. They are sick someday, or they just don't want to, they don't feel like it. Women, they're stressed out, or, they and then they just kind of capitulate. Everyone's, I guess, giving in to having sex with their partner because they don't want to have an argument. They don't want the other person to feel bad. They want to make sure that the other one's ego is boosted. They don't want to have problems in the relationship. And really, men and women are doing this at the same time. I thought this was fascinating because we never talk about men in that way. We always just think they want sex all the time with anyone, which is absolutely ridiculous. And again, this was really the only research I've seen that talks about how men were viewing the sex that they were having, that they also viewed as consensual. I mean, this was consensual, non-wanted sexual activity, which goes back to my point that, again, these false claims that women are claiming that they were raped or sexually assaulted is completely fabricated. Most women are having, they know the difference between sex they don't want and rape. So, and sex that they don't want is extremely normalized, just as much as sexual assault is normalized.
I'm going to also post a question right now because we know that the audience on today, like a lot of you are probably not surprised by a lot of the things that were discussed because, working with survivors or doing prevention work, we know this stuff is really normalized. However, there are prevention educators on the call, there are advocates on the call, and others. So I was just wondering, and I posted, how might you be able to use some of the information we discussed today in your work? If, as you were going through, you're like, oh, wow, maybe, this might be helpful for this, or I could use this in this discussion or in this training, or if anything comes up, and you might want to send that back, because if you've had the thought, we would love to share it with other people as well. And also saying again, too, you can post questions as needed. And while we're waiting to hear you come back, and if you have any ideas about incorporating it into your work, I had another question come in about coercive sexual environments and this idea of like neighborhood-based characteristics, which is something I personally, too, know less about. So I don't know if you could just share a little bit more about where that research has come from, or what we've learned more about this idea of like neighborhood-based environments as compared to just general sexual assault or violence happening without really thinking so much about specific neighborhood.
Well, similar to the research I just cited, and unfortunately, I guess, this work from the Urban Institute and their long research agenda is really some of the only work that has come out. Yeah, which is, it's astonishing in a way, and it is sad. But I think, you know, it is coming out of, I mean, as a sociologist and criminologist, a lot of crime has been mapped onto neighborhoods. So we can talk about crime and victimization happening on a neighborhood level in these kind of micro places. And so we also see harassment and violence happening within these systems. And they can happen differently in neighborhood environments based on neighborhood and place. So it's really stemming out of the idea of, thinking about social disorganization, urban areas where there is a lot of violence and crime. I mean, think about Milwaukee. There's certain areas that are experiencing more violence and crime, more victimization. But these researchers were thinking, well, how does that create different types of environments? How does that create environments, particularly for youth, navigating through all this chaos in their lives? And let's think about how women in particular, young girls of color, are internalizing these environments that sexual harassment is extremely normalized. You have catcalling all the time, over-sexualization of girls, and especially Black girls. And in my current work in the courtrooms, myself and my colleague Samina Mullah are seeing this as well. So we see the over-sexualization of Black women's bodies, Black girls' bodies, in the courtrooms when they come to court for a rape trial. And at age 11, 12, these young women are being perceived as sexual, experienced, used to it. And I think that is also stemming from the idea that something is different, something is playing out in these particular neighborhoods or urban environments. Now, whether that's true or not, and it has a lot of research needs to be done, like I said, in a variety of contexts, because we also see that kind of stuff on college campuses. But it is very different because college is college. It's not, you're older, right? And there's a lot of resources available to you. In these neighborhoods, when you have young women growing up from very early ages experience sexual harassment, and there's not neighborhood resources for them, the schools aren't behind them. Schools used to be safe places to go to where kids could have meals, talk to their teachers about these issues, and they couldn't talk about it at home. And that's just no longer the case, right? With zero tolerance policies, you have mandated reporting, and they're in trouble, and they're funneled into the system for protecting themselves, and they just really have nowhere to go. So I think that's part of a coercive environment as well. Lots more research needs to be done, and I think it's really a wonderful and interesting, promising line of work I'm really excited about.
All right, well, fantastic. We are always able to take more questions, and I'm just going to real quickly pull up. We're going to go all the way back. You'll be like, wow, good memory, so that you can get contact information if you want to follow up on that slide. And you can always reach out to us at WCASA. We will be archiving this webinar and posting it in the next few weeks. We'll also be sending out slides. And I wanted to share, too, in regards to using some of the information in work, there were a lot of quotes and things that were up on slides. And I know that for prevention educators, sometimes having just a discussion topic of what do you think about this being said by a young person? Do you agree with them? Do you not? Why or why not? And then in this case, it sounds like there's even the ability to then give the age and sort of talk about, does that make things different? And Heather, I believe you kind of talked about sharing that in your classes as well, right? If you could maybe share just a little bit before we wrap up.
And I mean, that's a college, teaching my college courses. Excuse me. I teach a course on sexual offenses. So I think that's initially what Rose and I were talking about. As I use some of these quotes or excerpts from my work and then ask students, So let's dissect this quote, right? Let's analyze it. Let's think about what kind of picture are you getting from this quote? Who do you think this person is? Who's the perpetrator? Who is, what's going on here? What's the relationship? And we just kind of work on teasing out all that stuff. And then, of course, I say, well, would you be surprised to know that this, girl is 12 years old? And they really are shocked because we have this idea that children aren't talking this way. They don't know things. They're innocent. And that's just really not the case that I found in my research. And I think if anyone knows children, works with children, has children, knows that, they are pretty adept at deciphering life and social life and what they're learning, and they're learning it from us. We're basically telling them what is right and what is wrong, what relationships are acceptable, and when they're not. And so I've used that in my courses that go over pretty well. Again, it's, 19, 20-year-olds. I'm absolutely fascinated by what people are doing in schools, because from what I've learned at elementary and maybe middle school ages, what I've heard is that it's almost impossible to talk about these issues, to talk about sex or healthy sexuality, to talk about, of course, never to talk about homosexuality, relationships, and to really get into some of the details that obviously kids are experiencing. So it's sad, it's problematic, they're experiencing it, but no one will talk to them about it. The schools won't allow educators to say certain words or address situations. I'm fascinated by that. That's an unbelievable environment that we're trying to kind of navigate today, so.
On that note.
Right. Great. Good luck.
Good luck. No, because you're all out doing it, and
yeah, really.
I know that there are good things happening in the state, and there are some people who've had success getting into even really, really challenging environments in schools and, in prisons and corrections and military. And so we've got stuff happening, and we thank you all for your work doing it and wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.